Welcome to Railfans. I'm Shane Seguin. Join us as we discover Ottawa's O train, Toronto's subway, and Montreal's metro system together. I'm Shane Seguin, and joining me today is Seth McDermott, who's a Toronto transit enthusiast. Thank you for joining me today.
Yeah, glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
So today we're going to be talking about the Toronto Transit Commission's Line 3, or the Scarborough RT. Definitely a line that has a very interesting history, very interesting technology, an interesting future that's about to be realized, and that it's going to be shut down in 2023, several years before the replacement service will be completely built and in service. So it would be great to talk today about where the line began, all the different intricacies that really set it apart from any other line in Toronto, and how it's a precursor for linear induction motors and that kind of transit system in the world. So let's start off by talking a bit about the history. Line 3 Scarborough, light rapid transit line in part of Toronto's subway system, mostly elevated, 6 stations, connects with Line 2 Bloor-Danforth at Kennedy Station. Can you talk a little bit about this interesting line? Tell us a little bit about how it started.
Yeah. So first, just as we get started, I want to make the note that I work in the public transit industry as well as being an enthusiast in my spare time. So just to state up front, all of the views expressed in this are going to be my own, not that of my employer or my clients or anyone I work with. Just covering all the bases. The line's history is one of the more interesting parts of Toronto's transit history, really, and its ongoing existence has been quite a soap opera of sorts. And it really reflects a number of factors that were all kind of converging in the mid to late 20th century, in both the city and also at the provincial levels. So there's a bit of background to kind of be aware of with the line's history that goes back almost 20 years before the line was actually opened. In 1967, Metro Toronto was created. And there was a decision made at that time when the various townships around Toronto were formed into these new cities or boroughs in the case of East York, that they needed these new downtowns. Separate from the main downtown in Toronto. And the idea was to create sort of urban places that would give these cities a sense of identity. And also commercial districts, so they wouldn't be completely, satellites dependent on the city of Toronto. And the 3 areas that really needed, according to planners, these new downtowns were North York, Scarborough, and Etobicoke, because the city of Toronto obviously was doing fine on its own, and then East York and York both had these older sort of commercial districts where there was at least a sense of a central area to go to, a main street, with shops and services, that kind of thing. But North York, Scarborough, and Etobicoke were all formed out of these old townships that were mainly rural and were starting to fill up with these suburban kinds of development. And so instead of having it be just one big barf of suburbia, they wanted to sort of center them around something. At the same year, the GO train system opened, the first line being Lakeshore from Oakville to Pickering. And that's important because around the same time, the provincial government and the newly created Metro Toronto were looking for ways to integrate more of the transit around the city of Toronto, not just within the old city limits. Remember, at the time, there was still even a fare zone gap between the city of Toronto and the surrounding areas. So there was quite a hard line between what sort of counted as Toronto and not. But the suburbs were spilling over those borders really quickly. And so as part of that, there was this consideration of how regional transit should work. In short succession, the Bloor-Danforth subway opened, the extensions to Islington and Warden. The main original line had already been opened in 1966, but Scarborough got its first subway station, being Warden and Victoria Park, in 1968. But at the time, that really didn't go very far into Scarborough. It's very much in the southwest corner of the former city. Whereas the extension to Islington on the Etobicoke side, it was only 3 stations long, Old Mill, Royal York, and Islington, but it came a lot closer to the location of the planned sort of new downtown for Etobicoke, which was around Dundas and the 427, or the Dundas, Kipling, Bloor, Six Points area. So Etobicoke sort of had a better footing in terms of a transit line that would connect at least closely to the proximity of their new city center. Sort of moving beyond that, there was continued suburban growth starting in the early 70s, really. The creation of regional municipalities was a big deal in the early 70s into the 905. So really at the time, there was this huge consideration of what should be done about regional transit into the city. Coupled to that, there's a lot of factors. Coupled to that, in 1971, the Spadina Expressway was canceled as a result of a concerted effort by citizens and activists in the city of Toronto. And so that killed one of the key pillars to connecting the suburbs to the city of Toronto, which was the planned expressway network. So the provincial level authorities and the metro level authorities had to sort of go back to the drawing board and think how they're going to connect all these areas up. So leading out of that is what led to the creation of a program called Go ALRT. And Go ALRT was supposed to sort of take on the idea of what the GO train had started in 1967, but to be a separate system independent of mainline rail, so that it wouldn't be subject to the whims of the freight companies, or CN or CP at the time. And they wanted it to be easily able to extend into the suburbs, cheap to build, because, I mean, you're going much longer distances than you were with the initial parts of the subway. Initially, they wanted it to be actually a maglev, which is pretty cool. The idea of like a suburban maglev system. Now, it wasn't the kind of train that would go at like 500 kilometers an hour, like in Shanghai or something. But it was supposed to be a maglev technology, and they contracted with a West German firm, and they wanted to do a test line downtown between Union and the CNE. That ended up falling through. The West German government pulled support for the whole idea. What you would see that turn into, there was one line built with similar technology in Berlin, the M-Bahn, which was in service for a few years, covering a part of the U-Bahn system that had been sort of cut off by the Berlin Wall. So to get an idea of what the system might have looked like, just look at what the M-Bahn sort of turned into for a few years. Instead of being able to contract out of the country, the Ontario government created something called the Urban Transportation Development Corporation, the UTDC, and it was tasked with coming up with a new technology that would serve this suburban purpose. And so that was where the vehicle technology originally came from. So that's how this all sort of fits together, is the idea of using linear induction motors, which had been proven at a laboratory scale, and it was partially a German invention that had gone back decades earlier. There was sort of a proof of concept that had already been done, but this was the first time that it was really going to be used in a full-scale transit scenario. So it wouldn't be a full maglev. It wouldn't levitate off the rails. It would still have tracks, but it would be pulled along the track by this linear induction motor instead of the train having a motor on board. Around the same time, so 1973, the Scarborough Centre Mall opens, and they develop this new civic center with their new city hall, but it's in the middle of nowhere. It connected to the expressway system. It was right near the 401, but it had no serious prospect for transit connection at the time. Versus somewhere like Etobicoke, where you're just one station away from the existing subway line, so it's easy to build an extension, or North York, which planned its downtown along Yonge Street, which of course puts it directly in line with the Yonge subway. It wasn't built out that far yet, but there was an easy, obvious route to get up there. For Scarborough, it's kind of northeast of where the subway ended at Warden. It wasn't really clear how you'd get from Warden to Scarborough Centre, and the space in between was kind of industrial, not quite sure what to do with it space. Around the same time, 1973 or 1974, I'm a little bit fuzzy on the date, that was the last profitable year for the TTC's operations. which has a big impact on Toronto's transit planning. You'll see it pivot a lot after that happened, because prior to that, the TTC had more credibility to be planning its own extensions. They had a department within the agency that was responsible for planning extensions. And they planned everything up until the subway, the subway to Spadina, which opened in 1978, at the Spadina extension. And even though that actually opened after the TTC stopped being profitable, the planning had already started at the time. The other thing that happened around that time was North York received its subway expansion to first York Mills and then Finch in 1974. And so then North York was set up with a subway line directly on its, or through its new downtown area. So all of this was building to a situation where Scarborough felt kind of inadequate or neglected by Metro compared to the other areas of the city in these newly burgeoning suburbs. 1974 as well, the TTC reversed their streetcar abandonment plan, which was going to scrap all the remaining streetcar lines in the city. And at the time, there was an issue with keeping streetcars because they needed new vehicles, the existing ones were falling apart, and the North American industry had also collapsed. Any of the streetcar makers no longer existed, really. And so the UTDC took on that role as well. They were going to develop a new streetcar for the city of Toronto. And these are relevant to each other because in the mid-1970s, Bloor-Danforth line extensions were planned to go to Kipling and Kennedy, but there was opposition to building the Scarborough end of that at grade. They wanted to build it at grade because there was an existing old railway alignment that Warden was actually already positioned in, and they wanted to just carry it onto Kennedy Road. But people who lived in the suburban neighborhoods that were surrounding that alignment opposed it to the point that they agreed to build that extension underground. And if you look at that area today, that is currently the longest gap between stations on the TTC system. It's longer than the entire University line downtown between Warden and Kennedy, and it's all built underground. And so the economics of building essentially a subway underneath bungalows just it got worse and worse as that extension was being planned. And so in order to actually get further than just Kennedy, the TTC was looking at cheaper ways to build these suburban expansions, and they settled on the idea of using these high-speed streetcar lines. So the same vehicle that the UTDC was going to be developing for streetcar service in downtown Toronto would serve this double duty as this high-performance vehicle for the suburbs. And there were supposed to be two lines, one from Kipling and one from Kennedy. And the Kipling end in Etobicoke would have gone vaguely north into Rexdale. The Scarborough line was supposed to go from Kennedy, hit Scarborough Centre, and then keep going further to the northeast toward Markham Road, towards Seneca College, or not Seneca, Centennial College, that are all in that area. Now, the challenge came with the province having this other technology on the back burner, this Go ALRT system. Go ALRT had been dropped as a policy at that point, and the Ontario government was looking for a way to recoup the cost of that new technology development, which was higher than the cost of building a new, just a new kind of streetcar would be, because you're talking about developing a completely new kind of propulsion. And so they wanted a way to market the tech. If they weren't going to use it for the Go ALRT, then they were going to try to sell it to other cities. But in order to do that, they decided that they needed a demonstration line. And they took the Scarborough line as the perfect opportunity to do that. Because it was already going to be a separate line. It was not an existing subway extension, so it wasn't like they were cutting off a subway that was already planned to go somewhere. And they thought, well, we'll sacrifice the idea of using the streetcars on this line for the sake of testing out this new technology. Now, the city and the TTC were not happy about it because they had already got this plan in place. Kennedy had already been built, and a streetcar station had already been roughed in. including building a loop that was meant to handle streetcars at Kennedy Station. But the province basically forced their hand. And this is where the issue of profitability comes in, because at that point, the TTC had then become reliant on funding. And so you kind of can't say no at that point, because you're relying on it for your operations budget. And so that all sort of built to the Scarborough RT looking the way it does today. You had this line that was planned out for streetcars, including like the full alignment. You know, the whole route was planned out for streetcars, but they just plopped a different kind of train on it that used a completely different propulsion system, was gauged differently, so it can't connect with the rest of the TTC's track network, because the rails are standard gauge, where the rest of the TTC system is broad gauge, and it created this funny little orphan line out in Scarborough that has always, since that time, kind of become the TTC's redheaded stepchild. Like, they tolerate it, they put up with it because it provides service to Scarborough, and clearly a lot of people rely on it every day because of all of the bus service that it connects to within Scarborough. But actually maintaining the line and God forbid, improving the line has always been sort of at the bottom of the TTC's agenda when it comes to their rapid transit construction. There have been extensions proposed a couple of times to continue the route, pick it up the way it was originally supposed to go, like continue on to Markham Road, Centennial College, all those places, but it never made it past the route that it ended up being built to in the first phase, which was just Kennedy to McCowan. And the twin line, just before we forget, the twin line in Etobicoke never ended up being built. There was a platform roughed in at Kipling Station. You can see it today. It's across from the bus platform, but nothing ever further happened with that line.
So it's definitely a colorful, interesting story and history behind how the line became what it is today and how it was conceived. Now, you've touched on the technology that was chosen. So the Urban Transportation Development Corporation created the Intermediate Capacity Transit System Mark I trains, which the TTC refers to as the S series. These are linear induction motor trains, which sets them apart from a traditional train that has traction motors that physically turn the wheels of the train. So can you talk a little bit about the linear induction technology? How does that work? And visually, how do people distinguish that from a traditional track and train system?
Yeah. So I guess we'll start with the visual distinction, just because that's the easiest for people to relate to. The easiest way to tell is that there is a sort of what looks like a strip or like some sort of box between the two running rails that runs the full length of the track network in a linear induction system. In Scarborough's case, it's a bit raised off of the track bed, not as high as the running rails, but it fits in between all the tracks. And what it actually is it's a series of magnets, electromagnets, that correspond with a parallel set of magnets on the underside of the train carriage. And really the easiest way to think of what it is it's like taking a motor. Normally a motor in an electric vehicle would be cylindrical, and you would have a ring of electromagnets all the way around the cylinder, and then there's an inside drum with another set of magnets around it that fits inside the cylinder, and that's connected to the axles or the drivetrain, and that's what propels the vehicle. Basically, the electromagnets alternate which polarity they're on, and so it really rapidly pulls the inner coil in a rotating motion and turns the wheels. Now, in the case of a linear induction motor, you basically take that outer shell and unroll it and put it on the ground. So there's a big string of electromagnets that run along the ground, and they alternate polarity really fast. And the magnet on the underside of the train gets alternately attracted and repelled, and so it pulls the train along. So the train actually doesn't have an onboard motor in the traditional sense. The wheels are just sort of free rolling. It's all to do with the interaction between the magnets on the underside of the train and on the ground that pull the train forward. So it really is a precursor to what you'd see with maglev technology. That's where, that ended up going after linear induction motors, was the sort of they're still limited, but you see commercially successful maglevs around, or at least in commercial operation nowadays. So LIM was sort of a step toward what would become maglev technology, because it still used the traditional sort of familiar two rail system in addition to the magnetic rail in the middle. And the one sort of funny artifact of that is that when the Scarborough RT opened, it was a demonstration line. They were trying to figure out how this technology worked, what some of the ins and outs would need to be, and it actually created a situation where the train did slightly levitate off of the rails, to the point where there was concern about derailment potentially if the wheels sort of lost contact slightly, because obviously then you don't have any way to control your lateral motion, and so they made the flanges on those wheels especially high or tall, so that if the tires of the wheels lost contact with the rails, the flanges would still be there to sort of catch the wheels and not have it go just flinging off in sideways whenever you hit a turn.
Well, that's definitely an interesting fact about the train. What's interesting to note about linear induction motors is, obviously it evolved from the line in Toronto. Vancouver has a very extensive SkyTrain network now. The Expo line, the Millennium line, use very similar train, although it came slightly after the original trains in Scarborough. They have a Mark II train, have a Mark III train. They're looking at replacing the original Mark Is with potentially, it's undecided, but potentially Mark IV. Interestingly enough as well, you can also see this technology at Walt Disney World in the Magic Kingdom. The Tomorrowland Transit Authority ride uses linear induction motors to propel those around. And as well, a lot of theme parks, roller coasters, the launch system, rather than having a chain lift hill, it can be linear induction motors. That's how you get that tremendous boost directly off from the loading platform. So definitely an interesting technology, very unique. And also Detroit's People Mover that goes around central downtown Detroit. I think it's about 13 or 18 stations. It's a single track loop, similar idea as the Scarborough RT. So definitely an interesting technology, and how it evolved and developed and originated for the most part in Toronto in this sense.
Yeah. There are a couple more examples around the world. I know that Kuala Lumpur uses linear induction motor technology on a few of their lines, and the AirTrain in New York, the one to JFK, uses linear induction motors. They never used the Mark Is though. They were built later.
You brought it up just a while ago, how Kennedy was actually roughed in for streetcars. Now, for anybody that goes on Wikipedia, I'm sure everybody does, if you look up Line 3, there's actually a picture of Kennedy Station where you see the platform and the track, and you see sort of like paver tile kind of platform underneath, which was, I guess, theoretically supposed to be the streetcar platform. So can you talk a little bit about that? Do we see any other intricacies like that elsewhere on the line, or is it mostly just a thing that we see at Kennedy?
So it's mostly visible at Kennedy because Kennedy was further along in the construction process. Kennedy was all built as one station all at once, because if you look at the timeline, Kennedy opened to the Bloor-Danforth subway, now known as Line 2, in 1980, and the Scarborough RT ended up opening in 1985. So there was kind of a continuous construction project that was happening at Kennedy. that led to more of the finishes being put in there compared to other stations. So you don't see the same kind of edge tile underneath the platform that's actually in use at the rest of the stations on the line, because they were at an earlier stage of site preparation, site work at the time that the Ontario government swooped in and required the use of the ICTS technology. But there are other sort of relics that you would see on the line in terms of its design, just in general. So staying at Kennedy, there is a loop west of the station platform that was originally intended to support streetcar operation, because the vehicles that they wanted to use were essentially the same form factor as the streetcars that were on city streets downtown. It wasn't like a modern, what you consider a modern light rail line with high floor or bidirectional trains. It was literally just a streetcar, but on a totally grade separated line. So it was still going to have a loop. And the Scarborough RT opened with that loop in place and actually functional, but they experienced a number of derailments when they were trying to use that loop, because it's such a challenging curve to negotiate if you're not talking about a streetcar, that they ended up cutting the loop off. It's still accessible from the rest of the line, but it's used just for storage now. What they did was they took the platform that had been built that was supposed to be the boarding platform to go northbound/eastbound. It's kind of weird the way they talk about directions on the RT. It flips from being north-south to being east-west halfway along, because it's kind of like that L shape. So they took the boarding platform that would be going north and they extended it out over the first track. So they essentially narrowed the line through Kennedy into a single track that had platforms on both sides. And the loop became this dead-end stump off the end. You will still see trains pulled into that space sometimes. Mainly it's when a train breaks down, and especially if it's during rush hour, they'll pull a train through the station and just park it in the loop so that it doesn't interrupt the rest of the service, and then they'll just go and retrieve it after rush hour. So that's the other sort of main feature that you would see is that loop being there, and it's like, why is it there otherwise? Beyond that, I would really just say the tightness of a lot of the curves on the line. So the curve exiting Kennedy is quite sharp, certainly much sharper than a traditional subway would be able to handle, as well as the curve that goes through a tunnel just north of Ellesmere Station. Both of those segments are quite challenging for other trains to negotiate, and you would see that actually come into play later when they were talking about what the future of the RT would be, because the Mark II and Mark III trains that were developed after UTDC was absorbed into Bombardier are longer than the Mark I trains, to the point that they can't negotiate the curves on the Scarborough RT. So that's why the Scarborough RT, there was never a consideration of, just upgrading to the Mark II or Mark III vehicles. I don't want to say no consideration, but no serious consideration, because when you start looking at the specifics of the line, you'd have to rebuild so much of the line to make it even compatible with those versions of the equipment that it's just not worth doing.
I definitely can't comment about the reliability at the beginning. I'm hoping you can, but I know over time reliability has definitely become an issue. The line was originally intended to have a 20-year lifespan, and it has definitely gone much farther than that. So can you talk a little bit about how the reliability on this line has evolved or degraded as time has gone on?
Yeah. So originally, like any other line, it had some teething troubles, chief among them being the derailments in that loop at Kennedy that led to the sort of reconstruction of that station. For a while after that, the RT performed pretty well. It is largely automated. The operators on board really just control the doors. So a lot of the system's day-to-day operations are very tightly planned out. So in that sense, it functions as like this nice little self-contained system, sort of devoid of a lot of the external factors that might influence it if it was part of like the broader subway network, really. But it has some sort of design features, as well as, like we said, just the aging process that led to the reliability declining. For starters, there are no crossover tracks between Kennedy and McCowan. So whenever any part of the line gets interrupted, the whole line is down. There's no opportunity to short-turn the service or switch up the order of trains. Once the trains are on that line, they're on that line. The only way to switch up the order of the trains would be to pull a train through Kennedy into that loop, which again, they don't want to do under normal operations unless they really have to. So that led to some constraints when it came to line management, and you'll see whenever there's an outage that you need shuttle buses for the entire line, which isn't ideal. But then the reliability definitely started to decrease as the age increased. Like you said, the line was only supposed to have about a 20-year shelf life before it needed some kind of repair or upgrade or just a new generation of equipment coming in. Unfortunately, like I said, in the meantime, between when the line opened and when that 20-year deadline would hit, the technology used in the new vehicles changed. The new vehicles were larger in general, heavier, and all of that led to a situation where this demonstration line was really no longer up to the task of those new vehicles. The technology had largely moved on from what was present in the Toronto context. And also, I believe there were some features that were employed in Vancouver when they were looking at how to make the line fully automated that made the system more resilient than what the line in Toronto would be. One of those being having detection of obstacles at track level that the Toronto situation just didn't have. Partially because they still had a crew member on board the train at least, so you could, in theory, deal with some of the risks of operating any transit line, but because the line didn't have necessarily all of the features that would end up being employed on the automated lines that were to come, it just left it in a less resilient position when it came to the computer system that was supposed to be driving the trains and running all of the operations. You kind of had to throw this big kill switch of like, okay, well, everything has to stop now because there's something going on that the computer doesn't understand, and it's either stop or go. So that led to an issue. In addition to that, I mean, as the trains age, you start to see just the normal effects of aging on any vehicle. They start needing structural rehabilitation, but in addition to that, the linear induction technology started to show its age, and that's of special concern in this situation because you started having problems like what I said before about the train slightly levitating off the rail. There was a problem where there would be these momentary lapses or glitches in power that would cause the train to actually strike the rail. Like it would sort of thud onto the rail for a quick second. And so that was causing damage to the running rails and the linear induction technology. And as a result, the TTC had to make a decision to limit the speed on the line. So you'll notice today the line is slower than it would have been if you'd ridden the line in, let's say, the 90s. The trains are also quite a bit louder because some of those intermittent moments where it rubs the rail funny create these really loud vibrations that you can hear in the train, and also if you're just standing on a bridge or somewhere nearby where you can hear the trains moving through. And then, clearly the shelf life of the line has been greatly exceeded. It opened in 1985. If you talked a 20-year time horizon, that'd be 2005. We're now in 2021, so it is 36 years old. So it has lasted much longer than it was planned to. So any of the sort of complaints around the line's reliability, it should come as no surprise considering it's lasted almost twice as long as it was originally meant to. Oh, and one other serious consideration is ice. That is a major factor in the line's reliability. Ice buildup around the linear induction motor on the ground frequently creates problems in the winter. There's a period, I forget exact dates, but late 2010s, before COVID, when the line was being shut down for weeks at a time, or at least days at a time, depending on like what would happen during winter storms. There would be severe disruption to the reliability of service during the winter, and so it created the situation where Scarborough residents were again feeling sort of underserved, or like the transit in their area was inadequate, because suddenly if you live in Scarborough, that means you have to plan so much more time in your day in the winter to deal with the possibility that the RT would just give out and then you'd be left on a bus. So that became a big sticking point as the line has aged, that it really stops being reliable when the snow starts flying.
Well, thank you very much for speaking to us today about the Scarborough RT. Definitely a historical and technologically significant line that's been part of Toronto history for over 30 years now. Seth McDermott, thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, thank you very much.